Welcome back to Eco 102. So let's begin our second week's lecture by trying to look at chapter 21 from your text, Parkin, Powell, and Matthews. The text is named as Economics. We're going to start talking about GDP, or what is better known as the gross domestic product, and we'll also learn how to measure gross domestic product or GDP, measuring economic growth, and also review the uses and limitations of real GDP. I hope before we start this chapter, you've had an opportunity to review the first lecture in the 4 parts as well as the YouTube video. So let's begin today's lecture. All right, what is gross domestic product or GDP? GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services which are produced within a country in a given time period. Please notice here this definition has 4 parts. We're looking at the market value. If I may ask you, if you think about market value, what comes to your mind? You'd be right if you were thinking this is not just the price of a good. If I asked you about the price of a good, you would just say X amount of pounds, dollars, euros, takas, whatever the currency you choose. But when we're looking at the market value, your immediate next question would be, what is the quantity of goods you want me to find out? So the market value would be calculated as price times quantity of goods. Let's look at the second part. We talk about the final goods and services. If we are referring to final goods and services, there must be an interim or intermediate goods and services, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides. We're limited to only measuring the market value of the final goods and services that are produced within a country. If you notice, the terminology says gross domestic product. Whichever nation that you choose to calculate the gross domestic product for, we will only measure the market value of the final goods and services which are produced within that country. And of course, there must be a given time period. Let me introduce you to the most important variable for your macroeconomics course, time. It is imperative that we realize over time everything changes. And for us, GDP measured over time, continuously changing, is what introduced us in the previous lecture about a business cycle. So moving along. So let's talk a little bit more about what is market value. GDP is a market value. Goods and services are valued at their market prices. So, for example, if we're looking at apples and oranges, computers and ice cream, and we add the market values, so we have a total value of output in pounds. The book that you'll be referring to is published in the UK. Time and again, we will probably refer to UK as the domestic nation. If we choose not to use that, we can always refer to any country that you wish to call it as a domestic country. And the currency that we use will be in pounds. You may alternate that with any other currency that suits your liking. So, we'll be looking at any kinds of goods and services and multiplying it by the quantity of them produced. Final goods and services. Now, we mentioned earlier in our definition that GDP is the market value of all final or finished goods and services that are produced within a country. A final good or service, as the slide tells you, is an item which the consumer buys at the final endpoint. In contrast to an intermediate good, or you may refer to it as a raw material if you choose, which is used as a component of a final good or service. Now, it's very important that you realize the distinction between final goods and intermediate goods. This is a very important or a key point in this first section. If you exclude intermediate goods and services, you can avoid the problem called double counting. So let's take an example. If you wish to look at a nation that only produces cars. In order to produce cars, we're well aware we need several parts. If you looked at the cost of tires, material needed to build the engine, car seats, steering, dashboard, all the metal required to make the chassis of the car, and many other components. And then we calculated the price of the car as a whole as well. We would run into the problem known as double counting. So to avoid that, we exclude the intermediate goods or services, and we only look at the final goods and services. Now, produced within a country, which is whatever is your country of choice, the domestic production of that nation is utilized in order to call it a gross domestic product. In contrast to a different term you may be familiar with, known as GNP, or gross national product, which is the measure of any goods and services produced by any national of a particular country in a given time period. So GDP measures production during a specific time period. Normally, we refer to that time period as a year. Now, GDP and circular flow of expenditure and income is the foundation of our understanding of macroeconomics. Yes, it measures the value of production, which also equals total expenditure on final goods and total income. In other words, we'll begin this section by making a statement. GDP is equal to income is equal to expenditure. And over the next few slides, we will show how the circular flow of expenditure and income creates what we know as the flow of GDP. So, the circular flow will start by showing the transactions among 4 specific actors in your purple boxes. They are households, firms, governments, and the rest of the world. We are to link all these 4 actors through 3 separate markets: factor markets, goods markets, and the financial markets. Firms, as you're well aware, hire factors of production from households. It can be our labor. And the blue flow that you see in front of you, which represents Y, shows the total income paid by firms to households. On the one hand, this is an expenditure for the firm because it has to pay. On the other hand, it is an income for the household because it earns. When you as a household earn money, you will be consuming. And C represents consumption expenditure. Households buy consumer goods and services, and the red flows represented by C shows consumption expenditure of households who need to go to the goods market. Imagine you going to the grocery store after getting a salary and consuming, which means purchasing the products that you desire. Look how the goods market arrow extends further back to the firms. Imagine yourself in the grocery store or in any other market, maybe a clothing store. Somewhere, some firm had to produce either the food product you're purchasing or the clothing that you're purchasing. And that completes the very small circle from Y to C through households. Firms hire labor force through factor markets. Imagine the factor market as a platform, maybe bdjobs.com, where you hire the factor of production, the most important factor of production, labor. from the households. Once households earn, they consume through the goods market indirectly from the firms. Households consume after they earn, and whatever additional income they have left, households tend to save. We can represent the concept of financial market in a very simple form as perhaps bank or pension fund. So household savings travel to the financial market. But notice how firms hire through the factor market households' labor force. Imagine when the firms earn money, they too like to save their profits and income. Firm is a legal entity that is taken care of by some individual person or persons. So imagine each individual owner in a firm as a household also. You can also imagine the firms as being companies who also need to save into the financial market. Now there are two parts to this green arrow. You have the savings going from households to the financial market, and if as a firm you choose, you may borrow from the financial market in order to invest further. We'll come to that in the next slide. Notice the other green dots leading from the households to the government. When households start earning, they are responsible citizens, which means they will also have to pay taxes to the government. As we mentioned earlier, when firms wish to expand their businesses or continue their work, once they borrow, they will decide to invest through the goods market back to their own firms. So this is investment expenditure by the firms represented by the red flow. And you can always think of firms buying machinery or other kind of capital goods from other firms through the goods market. Governments buy goods and services as well in order to produce or incorporate any kind of infrastructure development. It is imperative that government must spend through the goods market through some sort of firms and utilize that fund by paying the firms who then hire households who then work, earn, consume, as well as save and pay taxes. Notice how the arrow moves from government to the goods market and into the firms. What about the rest of the world? We will look at two parts of this. Government, if in case it is running a deficit, will need to be borrowing. If it has a surplus, it may be able to repay some of the previously borrowed funds. On the other hand, you will see through the financial market, the rest of the world also can borrow or lend through the financial markets. We represent the rest of the world as a source of both export and import. As a result, you'll see the red arrow going from rest of the world through the goods market and firms as well. And the rest of the world borrows from us, any nation that you choose to be from, or lends back, depending on whether the net exports are positive or negative.